Robert Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Beverly Hills mansion, watching the morning sun paint the Hollywood hills in shades of gold. At 42, he had everything most people could only dream of. A tech empire worth hundreds of millions. A house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Cars that cost more than most people's homes. But if you looked closely, you'd notice something odd about this perfect picture. The house felt empty. Not just quiet empty, but soul empty. Like a beautiful shell with nothing living inside it. 3 years ago, Robert had hired a housekeeper. Through an agency. Her name was Maria Santos, and she came with good references and a work permit. She was in her late 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that told stories of hard work. When she first walked into his mansion, her eyes went wide for just a moment before she composed herself and got straight to business. "I clean very good," she had said in broken English, her accent thick and musical. "You no worry about nothing." That was exactly what Robert wanted to hear. He didn't need a chatty housekeeper who would ask about his day or comment on the weather. He needed someone invisible, someone who could maintain his space without disturbing his carefully ordered life. Maria was perfect for the job. She arrived every morning at 7 sharp, let herself in with the key he'd given her, and went about her work like a ghost. She cleaned every room except one, his private study, which stayed locked. She never asked why. She never asked about anything, really. Their conversations were limited to the basics. "Good morning, Mr. Chun. Coffee ready in kitchen. I go now. See you tomorrow." Her English was simple, sometimes mixed up, but she got her point across. Robert preferred it this way. Simple, clean, no complications. What Robert didn't know was that Maria understood far more than she let on. She noticed things. Like how he always ate breakfast alone, even though the dining table could seat 12 people. How he got dozens of calls every day but never seemed to have friends over. How he kept family photos turned face down on his desk, as if he couldn't bear to look at them. She also noticed how he talked to himself sometimes when he thought no one was listening. He'd pace around the kitchen while his coffee brewed, muttering about business deals and market trends. Sometimes he'd switch languages mid-sentence, speaking in what sounded like Chinese. Maria would pretend to be busy with her cleaning, but she listened to every word. Robert had no idea that his housekeeper was paying attention to his private moments. To him, she was just part of the furniture. Useful, reliable, but not really there in any meaningful way. He'd grown up poor, the son of Chinese immigrants who worked 16-hour days at their small restaurant. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, building his tech company from a garage startup to a multinational corporation. But success had come with a price. The higher he climbed, the more he felt he had to hide his past. His humble beginnings felt like a liability in the world of Silicon Valley millionaires. So he'd learned to speak differently, dress differently, even think differently. He'd built walls around himself so high that even he sometimes forgot what was on the other side. Maria saw these walls, though she never said anything. She'd dust around his awards and certificates, noting how they all bore the name Robert Chun, but never mentioned his parents or his background. She'd clean his closets, filled with expensive suits that looked like uniforms for a life. He was playing rather than living. The locked study fascinated her most. It was the only room in the house that felt real, even though she'd never been inside. Sometimes she'd see the light on under the door late at night, and she'd hear him in there, talking on the phone in that other language. His voice always sounded different when he spoke Chinese, softer somehow, more human. Maria had her own secrets, of course. Every morning, she'd arrive an hour early and sit in her car, reading news articles on her phone and translating documents for other immigrants in her community. She'd help people fill out government forms, write letters to employers, navigate the maze of American bureaucracy. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who could solve any problem, who understood systems and numbers in ways that seemed almost magical. But in Robert's house, she was just the quiet housekeeper who nodded and smiled and spoke broken English. She'd learned long ago that sometimes it was safer to appear less capable than you really were. People told you things when they thought you couldn't understand them. They let their guard down around you. They revealed themselves in ways they never intended to dot, so Maria cleaned and observed and kept her thoughts to herself. She watched Robert eat the same breakfast every morning alone at his massive kitchen island. She noticed how he never opened his mail right away, as if he was afraid of what it might contain. She saw how he'd sometimes stand in his hallway, staring at the family photos he kept face down, his hand hovering over them like he wanted to turn them over but couldn't bring himself to do it. Robert's daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. Up at 5:30 for a workout in his home gym. Shower, expensive suit, breakfast while checking his phone. By 7:30 he was usually on his first business call of the day. Maria would arrive right in the middle of this routine, slipping in through the back door like she was part of the house itself. She'd start with the kitchen, cleaning around him while he talked to investors and partners. He'd switch between English and Chinese depending on who he was talking to, never seeming to notice that she was there. These morning calls were often the most revealing. Without the pressure of face-to-face meetings, Robert would let his guard down slightly. He'd sound frustrated, worried, sometimes even scared. Maria understood every word, but she kept her expression neutral, her movements efficient. She'd learned to read people's faces, to understand the weight of their silences. Robert carried himself like a man who had everything, but she could see the loneliness in the way he held his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes when he thought. No one was watching. The house reflected this loneliness. It was beautiful but cold, like a museum exhibit of what a successful life should look like. The furniture was expensive but uncomfortable. The art was impressive but impersonal. Everything was perfect, but nothing felt lived in except for that. Lock study. Maria had been cleaning houses for 3 years, and she'd learned that homes told stories about their owners. Some houses were full of laughter and chaos, toys scattered around and family photos covering every surface. Others were neat and organized, reflecting people who had their lives under control. Robert's house was different. It was the home of someone who was hiding from his own life, but Maria never judged. She'd learned that everyone had reasons for their choices, reasons that weren't always visible from the outside. She did her job, kept her observations to herself, and went home each evening to her small apartment where she lived with her elderly mother. It was a simple arrangement that worked for both of them. Neither Robert nor Maria could have imagined that this careful balance was about to be shattered by a single phone call that would change everything they thought they knew about each other. It was a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but by the end of it, Robert's entire world would be turned upside down. He woke up at his usual time, went through his morning routine, and was sitting at his kitchen island with his coffee when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his business partner's name, and Robert answered it without thinking twice. "Good morning, David," Robert said, taking a sip of his coffee. But instead of the usual cheerful greeting, he heard something in David's voice that made his blood run cold. "Robert, we need to talk, right now. Can you come to the office?" There was something wrong. David sounded shaky, nervous, like he was trying not to panic. Robert had known David for 8 years, and he'd never heard him sound like this. "What's going on?" Robert asked, setting down his coffee cup. "Not over the phone? Just come in, please." The call ended, and Robert stared at his phone. A cold feeling was spreading through his chest. He tried calling David back, but it went straight to voicemail. He called the office, but the receptionist said David had called in sick. Something was very wrong. Robert's hands were shaking as he dialed his lawyer's number. When Michael picked up, Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Michael, I need you to check something for me, our company accounts. All of them, right now." "Robert, it's 7 in the morning. "What's going on? Just check them, but please." While Michael was logging into the banking systems, Robert called his accountant, then his financial advisor. Each call made the cold feeling in his chest grow stronger. Numbers weren't adding up. Transfers had been made that he didn't remember authorizing. Money was missing. When Michael called back, his voice was grim. "Robert, you need to sit down." "How bad is it?" "It's bad. Really bad. Someone's been moving money out of your business accounts for months? Small amounts at first, but it's been Getting bigger. We're talking about millions, Robert. Maybe 15, 20 million total. The phone slipped from Robert's hand and clattered onto the kitchen counter. $20 million gone. Robert felt like he couldn't breathe. His company, his life's work, his future, everything he'd built was crumbling around him. He picked up the phone with trembling fingers and started speaking in Chinese, his voice getting louder and more desperate with each word. When he was really upset, English felt too limiting. Chinese was his first language, the language of his emotions. And right now his emotions were overwhelming. He shouted into the phone, "This can't be happening! How could David do this to me? We were partners, we were friends." He was pacing around the kitchen now, switching between English and Chinese as he talked to Michael, then his accountant, then his bank. Each call brought worse news. The money was gone, moved to offshore accounts. David had disappeared. The company was basically bankrupt. Robert cried out, running his hands through his hair. "My God, I'm ruined. Everything I worked for, everything I built, it's all gone." He was so caught up in his panic that he didn't notice Maria approaching from the living room. She'd been dusting in there when she heard the commotion. She'd intended to just quietly leave him alone, but as she got closer, she could hear the pain in his voice. The desperation. Maria had been working in Robert's house for 3 years, and she'd never seen him like this. Usually he was so controlled, so composed, but now he looked broken, defeated. She could see tears in his eyes as he continued his phone calls. Robert was saying to someone, "The bank says the accounts are almost empty. How am I going to pay my employees? How am I going to save the company?" Maria had approached with his usual morning coffee, but now she hesitated. She could see how much he was suffering. For 3 years, she'd watched this man live his life in careful isolation, never letting anyone get too close. But now, in his moment of crisis, he was completely alone. She'd heard enough of his phone calls over the years to understand that his business was his whole life. He had no family that he talked to, no close friends who came over. If he lost his company, he would lose everything that gave his life meaning. Without thinking, Maria stepped forward and gently placed the coffee cup on the counter near him. Robert was still pacing, still talking rapidly in Chinese, still trying to figure out how to fix this disaster. Maria said softly. The words came out naturally in perfect Mandarin. "Sir, do you need help?" Robert stopped mid-sentence. The phone was still pressed to his ear, but he'd gone completely silent. Slowly he turned to look at Maria, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment neither of them moved. The only sound was the voice on the phone asking, "Robert? Robert, are you still there?" Robert's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the kitchen floor. He stared at Maria like he was seeing a ghost. "What did you just say?" he whispered. Maria's heart was pounding. After 3 years of carefully maintaining her cover, she'd just blown it in a moment of compassion. But seeing Robert in such pain had broken something inside her. She couldn't just stand there and watch him suffer alone. "I asked if you needed help," she said, still in Mandarin, her voice gentle but clear. Robert's legs felt weak. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter to steady himself. "You speak Chinese. You understand Chinese." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about the last 3 years. Maria nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand Chinese. I understand everything." The full weight of what this meant was hitting Robert like a physical blow. This woman, his housekeeper, had been listening to his private phone calls for 3 years. She'd heard his business discussions, his personal moments, his fears and frustrations. She'd understood every word he'd ever said in what he thought was privacy. "How long?" Robert asked, his voice barely audible. "Since the beginning," Maria admitted. "I've understood everything since the day I started working here." Robert felt betrayed, exposed, violated. But underneath those feelings was something else. Something he wasn't expecting. For the first time in 3 years, someone in his house actually understood him. Really understood him. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you pretend?" Maria took a deep breath. This was the moment she'd been dreading, but it was also the moment she'd been waiting for. Because sometimes it's safer to let people think you don't understand. People say things around you that they wouldn't say if they knew you were listening. So you've been spying on me? No, Maria said firmly. I've been working for you. But I've also been watching you struggle alone for 3 years, and I've wanted to help. Robert's mind was reeling. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his house, about his carefully maintained privacy, was a lie. But as he looked at Maria, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected to see. He saw understanding. Not judgment, not pity, but genuine understanding. And for the first time in years, Robert didn't feel completely alone. Robert stood there in his kitchen staring at Maria like she was a complete stranger, which, in a way, she was. After 3 years of thinking he knew exactly who she was, everything had changed in a single moment. The woman he'd dismissed as just a housekeeper had been understanding every word he'd ever said. Sit down, Maria said gently, still speaking in Mandarin. You look like you're about to fall over. Robert wanted to be angry. He wanted to feel betrayed and violated. But his legs were shaking and the financial crisis was still crushing down on him. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his mind spinning between the revelation about Maria and the disaster with his company. I can't deal with this right now, he said, switching back to English. I just lost $20 million. My business partner has disappeared. And now I find out my housekeeper has been lying to me for 3 years. Maria pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. For the first time since she'd started working there, she was sitting at his kitchen table as an equal, not as hired help. I never lied to you, she said quietly. I just didn't tell you everything. That's the same thing, Robert's voice cracked. You let me believe you couldn't understand me. You listened to my private conversations, my business calls, my personal moments. How is that not lying? Maria was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Let me ask you something, Robert. In 3 years, have I ever betrayed your trust? Have I ever shared your secrets with anyone? Have I ever used anything I heard against you? Robert opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. She was right. Maria had never gossiped about him, never asked for favors, never acted like she knew more than she should. She'd been the perfect employee, even while secretly understanding everything. That's not the point, he said, but his voice was less angry now. The point is that you deceived me. Yes, I did, Maria admitted, and I'm sorry for that. But I had good reasons. What reasons could possibly justify 3 years of deception? Maria took a deep breath. This was the conversation she'd been dreading, but also the one she'd been preparing for. Because I'm not really a housekeeper, Robert. That's not who I am. Robert looked at her more carefully. Now that she was speaking normally, he could see intelligence in her eyes that he'd somehow missed before. The way she carried herself was different too, more confident, more self-assured. Then who are you? My name is Maria Santos, and I have a PhD in economics from Beijing University. I was a professor there for 12 years, specializing in international business and financial markets. Robert felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. You're a professor? I was, until I published a paper criticizing government economic policies. I had to leave China very quickly after that. When I came to America, my degree wasn't recognized here. I couldn't get work in my field without going through years of certification processes that I couldn't afford. The pieces were starting to fall into place in Robert's mind. So you became a housekeeper. I became whatever I needed to be to survive. I clean houses, I translate documents, I help people in my community with their finances. I do what I have to do to take care of my mother and myself. Robert sat back in his chair, processing this information. Your mother? She's 78 years old and has diabetes. She needs expensive medication and regular doctor visits. I can't afford to be unemployed, even for a few weeks. So when I take jobs like this, I let people think I'm just simple cleaning lady. It's easier that way. Easier how? Maria smiled. Sadly, people don't feel threatened by a cleaning lady who barely speaks English. They don't worry about her stealing their jobs or being smarter than them. They just want someone reliable who won't cause trouble. Robert was beginning to understand, but he still felt confused and hurt. But why didn't you tell me? I would have understood. Would you have? Maria asked gently. Think about it honestly. If I had come to you 3 years ago and said I was a professor of economics, would you have hired me as your housekeeper? Or would you have been suspicious about why someone with my background was applying for that job? Robert thought about it and realized she was probably right. He would have been suspicious. He might have thought she was trying to get close to him for some hidden reason. And even if you had hired me, Maria continued, would you have been comfortable having private business conversations around me? Would you have felt like you could relax in your own home? Robert knew the answer to that too. He valued his privacy above almost everything else. If he'd known Maria was highly educated and understood business, he would have been constantly on guard around her. I've been listening to your phone calls for 3 years, Maria said. I've heard you make deals, discuss strategies, talk about your fears and hopes. I know more about your business than anyone else in your life. That's exactly what bothers. Robert said. You know things about me that I never chose to share with you. I know that you're brilliant but stubborn. I know that you make decisions based on emotion sometimes instead of logic. I know that you're scared of failing because you grew up poor and you remember what that felt like. Robert flinched. She really had been listening to everything. I also know, Maria continued, that you're about to make some very bad decisions because you're panicking. And I know that if you don't get help soon, you're going to lose everything. What do you mean? Maria leaned forward. I've been watching you build this company for 3 years. I've seen you make smart moves and stupid moves. Right now, you're in crisis mode, and you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. What mistake? You're going to try to handle this alone. You're going to make desperate moves to save the company quickly. You're going to take risks that you normally wouldn't take, and you're going to end up losing everything. Robert wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. That was exactly what he was planning to do. He was already thinking about taking out massive loans, selling assets at below-market prices, anything to get quick cash. I've studied corporate recoveries, Maria said. I know what works and what doesn't. I know the mistakes that companies make when they're in crisis, and I know how to avoid them. So you're saying you can help me? I'm saying I've been wanting to help you for 3 years. Every time I heard you struggling with a decision, every time I saw you making a mistake, I wanted to speak up. But I couldn't because I was just the housekeeper. Robert looked at her carefully. And now? Now you know who I really am. Now you can decide if you want my help or if you want me to pack up my cleaning supplies and leave. Robert's mind was racing. His business partner had betrayed him. His company was on the verge of collapse. He was facing financial ruin. And the person offering to help him was someone he'd been completely wrong about for 3 years. Why should I trust you? He asked. You've been lying to me since the day we met. Because, Maria said simply, I'm the only person in your life who actually knows you. I've seen you at your best and your worst. I've heard you when you thought no one was listening. I know your strengths and your weaknesses better than anyone. She paused, then added, and because I'm probably the only person who can help you save your company. Robert sat there in silence, weighing his options. He could fire Maria and try to handle the crisis alone. He could stick with what he knew, even if it meant losing everything. Or he could take a leap of faith and trust the woman who had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. If I say yes, he said finally, things change. Everything changes? You're not my housekeeper anymore? Maria nodded. I know. And I need to know everything. No more secrets, no more pretending. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly. Agreed. Robert looked at her one more time, seeing her clearly for the first time in 3 years. Then let's save my company. The first thing Maria did was unlock Robert's study. For 3 years, this room had been his private sanctuary, the one place in the house where he could be himself. Now, as he watched Maria walk through the door he kept locked, Robert felt like he was crossing a line he could never uncross. We need to spread everything out, Maria said, looking around the room. Bank statements, contracts, employee records, everything. If we're going to save this company, I need to see the whole picture. Robert hesitated. This room contained his most private documents, his personal financial records, even old family photos he'd never shown anyone. But he was out of options. His company was bleeding money, and Maria was his only hope. There's a safe behind that painting, he said quietly. The combination is my mother's birthday. Maria turned to look at him. You keep important documents in a safe locked with your mother's birthday? Don't read into it, Robert said. But his voice was softer than usual. Over the next hour, they turned the study into a war room. Papers covered every surface. Maria had changed out of her cleaning clothes and was now wearing a simple business outfit she'd brought from home. Seeing her like this, Robert could finally see the professor she'd once been. Okay, Maria said, studying a stack of financial reports. This is worse than I thought, but it's not hopeless. $20 million is gone, Robert said. How? Is that not hopeless? Maria looked up from the papers. Because you're thinking like someone who's never been poor. You're thinking that losing $20 million means you're finished, but I've seen families survive on $20. I've seen companies rebuild from nothing. The question isn't how much money you've lost. The question is how much fight you have left. Robert sat down heavily in his chair. I don't know anymore. I built this company from nothing once, but I was younger then. I was hungry. Now I'm tired and I don't know if I can do it again. Then don't do it the same way, Maria said. Simply, the first time you built this company like you were trying to prove something. You were trying to show the world that a poor kid from Chinatown could make it big, but you're not that kid anymore. She pulled out a notebook and started writing. This time we build it right. Not flashy, not desperate. Smart. What are you? Mean? Maria pointed to a list of numbers on one of the financial reports. Your biggest problem isn't the money your partner stole? Your biggest problem is that you've been running this company. Like you're still afraid someone's going to take it away from you, Robert frowned. What does that mean? It means you've been hoarding cash, making safe investments, avoiding risks. You've been so focused on protecting what you have that you've forgotten how to grow. She was right, and Robert knew it. After his company had become successful, he'd become conservative, maybe too conservative. He'd been so afraid of losing everything that he'd stopped taking the smart risks that had made him successful in the first place. Look at this, Maria said, spreading out a map of Asia on the desk. Your company makes software that helps businesses manage their supply chains. Do you know which part of the world has the most complex supply chains? Asia, right? And do you know which part of the world your company has barely touched? Robert looked at the map. She was right again. His company had focused mainly on American and European markets. Asia was a huge opportunity they'd never seriously pursued. The problem is, Robert said, I don't know the Asian market well enough. I've been away from that world for too long, Maria smiled. But I do. I spent 12 years in China studying how businesses work there. I know the regulations, the cultural expectations, the business practices. I know which companies are looking for exactly what you're selling. Over the next 3 days, they worked 18 hours a day. Maria would arrive at sunrise, and they wouldn't stop until well past midnight. The house that had once been quiet and orderly was now filled with the constant sound of phone calls, printing, and intense discussions. Maria was relentless. She'd spent years watching Robert make business decisions, and now she was finally free to tell him when he was wrong. At first, Robert found it frustrating. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he'd thought of as an employee. You're being emotional, Maria said during one heated discussion about whether to sell some of the company's assets. You don't want to sell the Los Angeles office because it was your first big purchase. But keeping it doesn't make business sense. It's not about emotion, Robert argued. It's about maintaining our presence in key markets. No, it's about your ego, Maria said bluntly. You're afraid that selling it will make you look weak. But keeping it will make you bankrupt. Robert wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. The Los Angeles office was expensive to maintain and wasn't generating enough revenue to justify the cost. He'd been keeping it for sentimental reasons, not business reasons. Fine, he said finally, we'll sell it. But Maria wasn't finished. And we're not just selling it. We're selling it to a Chinese company that's been trying to establish a presence in California. I've already reached out to them. They'll pay above market value because the location is strategic for them. Robert stared at her. You reached out to them? When? Yesterday, while you were on the phone with the lawyers. I know the CEO. We were colleagues in Beijing. This was what Robert was learning about Maria. She didn't just have good ideas, she had connections. People he'd never heard of, companies he'd never considered, opportunities he'd never seen. Her network was completely different from his, and it opened up possibilities he'd never imagined. There's something else, Maria said. I've been looking at your employee records. You have 3 software engineers who speak Mandarin. So they're wasted in their current positions? They could be leading our expansion into China, but instead they're working on routine maintenance projects. Robert pulled up the employee files on his computer. Maria was right. He had talented people who were underutilized because he hadn't been thinking globally. We restructure the whole company, Maria continued. We stop trying to compete in markets where we're just one of many options. Instead, we focus on markets where we have unique advantages. What advantages? Maria pointed to Robert. You're Chinese American. You understand both cultures. You can build bridges between East and West in ways that your competitors can't. I've been trying to hide my background for years, Robert said. I thought it would hold me back. It will if you're trying to be someone you're not, Maria said. But if you embrace it, it becomes your biggest strength. They worked through the night, creating a complete restructuring plan. By morning, they had a strategy that would not only save the company but potentially make it more successful than it had ever been. But the real breakthrough came when Robert finally opened up about his family. He'd been so focused on the business that he'd forgotten why he'd started it in the first place. My parents work 16 hours a day in their restaurant, he told Maria as they took a break at sunrise. They never got to see me grow up because they were always working. I swore I'd never live like that. But you do live like that, Maria said gently. You work all the time. You have no friends, no family in your life. You've become exactly what you were trying to avoid. Robert looked around his empty house and realized she was right. He'd been so busy building a successful life that he'd forgotten to build a life worth living. Maybe it's time to change that too, he said. Maria smiled. Maybe it is. 6 months later, Robert stood in the same spot where his world had nearly collapsed, but everything was different now. The kitchen that had once echoed with his desperate phone calls was now filled with the warm smell of coffee and the sound of Maria's laughter as she talked to someone in Shanghai. Yes, the contracts are ready, she was saying in Mandarin to their newest client. Mr. Chun will review them this afternoon and we can sign tomorrow. Robert smiled as he listened. 6 months ago, he would have been making that call himself, stressed and worried about every detail. Now he could focus on the bigger picture while Maria handled the negotiations. She was better at it than he was anyway. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first month had been brutal. They'd worked 20-hour days, restructuring deals, selling assets, and convincing creditors to give them time. Robert had to swallow his pride more than once, admitting to investors that his company had been mismanaged and asking for second chances. But Maria had been right about everything. The Asian expansion had been a huge success. The Chinese company that bought their Los Angeles office had also become their biggest client, signing a 5-year contract worth more than the $20 million they'd lost. The 3 Mandarin-speaking engineers were now leading a team of 12, developing software specifically for the Asian market. "Good morning, boss," Maria said, hanging up her phone and grinning at him. "I told you to stop calling me that," Robert sighed, but he was smiling too. "Fine. Good morning, business partner." That was another change. 2 months ago, Robert had made Maria an official partner in the company. She owned 30% of the business now, and her official title was Chief Financial Officer. But really, she was much more than that. She was his closest advisor, his cultural bridge to markets he'd never understood, and somehow she'd also become his closest friend. How did the Shanghai call go? Robert asked, pouring himself coffee. They want to double their order for next quarter, Maria said. Apparently, our software helped them reduce their shipping costs by 40%. Robert shook his head in amazement. 6 months ago, he'd never even heard of this company. Now they were one of his biggest success stories. There's something else, Maria said, her voice becoming more serious. I got a call from my old university in Beijing. They want me to come speak at their business conference next month. That's fantastic, Robert said. You should go. They want both of us to go, together. They want to hear about our partnership, how an American company successfully expanded into Asian markets. Robert felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. For years, he'd avoided anything that might connect him back to China. He'd been so focused on being seen as American that he'd almost forgotten his Chinese heritage entirely. I don't know, he said. Public speaking isn't really my thing. Maria gave him a look that he'd become very familiar with over the past 6 months. It was the look that said she could see right through his excuses. Robert, you've been hiding from who you are for so long that you've forgotten how powerful it can be. You're not just an American businessman or just a Chinese immigrant. You're both, and that makes you special. She was right, as usual. Over the past 6 months, Robert had slowly started embracing parts of himself that he'd kept locked away. He'd started speaking Chinese more often, not just in private but in business meetings with Asian clients. He'd begun incorporating Chinese business practices into his company culture, and for the first time in years he felt like he was being authentic. Okay, he said finally, let's go to Beijing. Maria's face lit up. Really? Really, but you're doing most of the talking. Deal. Later that day, Robert found himself in his study, but it looked completely different now. The family photos that had been face down for years were now displayed proudly on his desk. There was one of his parents on their wedding day, another of them at the grand opening of their restaurant, and a recent one of all 3 of them together at dinner last week. That was another big change. Robert had reconnected with his parents. It had started with a simple phone call after Maria had convinced him that hiding from his family was just another way of hiding from himself. The conversation had been awkward at first. There were years of distance to bridge, but his parents had been overjoyed to hear from him, and now they had dinner together every Sunday. You know what I realized? Robert said to Maria as she joined him in the study. What? All these years I thought success meant becoming someone different? Someone better than who I started as? But real success is becoming more of who you really are. Maria nodded. It took me a long time to learn that too. When I first came to America, I thought I had to make myself smaller, less threatening, less intelligent. I thought that was the only way to survive. And now? Now, I know that my intelligence, my education, my background, those aren't things to hide, they're gifts to share. Robert looked around the study. The walls were covered with new plans for company expansion, partnership agreements with Chinese firms, and photos from recent business trips to Hong Kong and Singapore. But there were also personal touches now. A photo of Maria with her mother, a painting that Robert's father had given him years ago, a small Chinese flag alongside the American one. I have something to tell you, Robert said. I've been thinking about our next expansion. Oh, where to now? Mexico, and I think your language skills could come in handy again, Maria laughed. You know, I speak Spanish too, right? I figured, is there anything you can't do? I can't cook, Maria said, which is why I'm very grateful that you've been taking cooking lessons from your mother. That was true. Another way Robert had reconnected with his heritage was by learning to cook the dishes his mother had made when he was young. His kitchen, which had once been used only for coffee and takeout, now saw regular use. He'd even started hosting dinner parties, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. Speaking of cooking, Robert said, my parents want to. Have you and your mother over for dinner this weekend? They do? My mother wants to thank the woman who saved her son's business. And my father wants to meet the brilliant professor who convinced me to stop being ashamed of where I come from. Maria wiped her eyes. She'd never expected that her decision to speak up in Chinese that desperate morning would lead to all this. She'd thought she was just offering to help with a business crisis. She hadn't realized she was helping to heal a man's relationship with himself. "There's one more thing," Robert said. "I've been talking to some investors about starting a foundation." "What kind of foundation?" "One that helps immigrants start businesses. I want to create a program that recognizes foreign degrees, provides business training, offers microloans. I want to help people like you, people like my parents, people who have incredible skills, but no one gives them a chance." Maria stared at him. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. We've proven that diversity isn't just good for society, it's good for business. I want to help other people discover what we discovered." "Which is what?" Robert thought for a moment. The things that make us different aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're strengths to celebrate." As the sun set over Beverly Hills, Robert and Maria sat in the study planning their foundation. The house that had once been a lonely showcase of success was now a home filled with purpose and partnership. The business that had nearly collapsed was now stronger than ever. And two people who had been hiding from their true selves had found the courage to be authentic. "You know what the best part is?" Robert said as they finished their planning. "What?" 6 months ago, I thought I had everything, but I was completely alone. Now I know the difference between having everything and having everything that matters." Maria smiled. "And what matters?" "People who see you for who you really are, work that makes a difference, and the courage to be yourself, even when it's scary." Outside, the lights of Los Angeles twinkled in the distance. Inside, two friends continued, planning how to change the world, one partnership at a time.